Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach, everyone. One of my favorite stories about the late, great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel is how he opened his keynote address at the Conference of Religion and Race in Chicago in 1963, a conference where he would first meet Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and one, therefore, that would change his theological approach to Jewish action and responsibility. He opened his speech like this. At the first conference on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. Moses' words were, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may celebrate a feast to me." While Pharaoh retorted, "Who is the Lord, that I should heed this voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." Heschel continued, "The outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but is far from having been completed. In fact, it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a person of color to cross certain university campuses." Stated with quintessential Heschel wit, yet also dramatic sincerity, the words he spoke that morning were met with laughter at first, and then somber head nods immediately thereafter. Humor and frustration, celebration and heartbreak. This is the paradox of Passover. Because when Heschel spoke about that January morning was the part of this amazing holiday that is perhaps the most challenging, both theologically and pragmatically for us. Because while we spend the first 2 days of Pesach sitting around our Seder plates, raising our cups while raising our voices in song and in prayers of gratitude, Chol HaMoed and the last days of Yom Tov present us with a serious question that demands a response. Did you want to have a party, or did you want a journey to freedom? It's a question, to be fair, that we have been asked since our ancestors crossed the Yam Suf. We remember, as Assistant Cantor Gutman read so beautifully this morning in our Torah portion, that in the wake of that great miracle, while the last Israelite runs to the shore and the waves come crashing down on the pursuing Egyptian army, that Miriam leads the Israelites in song and dance, and then not long thereafter, the party stops, and our ancestors begin almost immediately looking back to Egypt, rather than forward to a land flowing with milk and honey. Pesach is a central narrative of who we are. It is a reminder that just like those men, women, and children who were liberated from the tethers of oppression, we too are given the opportunity to cross the sea and journey to a promised land. But we are also reminded, perhaps painfully so and frustratingly so, that the promised land is not just over the other side of the Yam Suf. We don't get to go from slavery to redemption immediately, from bondage to utopia. We go into the Midbar, we go into the wilderness, and the wilderness is where we are meant to be until we can merit reaching the land flowing with milk and honey. The redemptive idea of Pesach, and in Judaism more broadly, is not relativism. It's not the peace and prosperity of one people in their ancestral homeland. It is an idea of a world, an entire world, filled with peace, with freedom. One where the prophet Yoel tells us that all people will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And one where the prophet Micha tells us that each individual will sit under his or her own vine and fig tree, and none will be afraid. None will be afraid. It seems pretty self-evident that that's not quite where we are. It's not when we are. Despite what we've been told by revisionist history books, by talking heads applauding us for solving the problems of inequality with civil rights legislation, for giving the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. his own day in the U.S. holiday calendar, for claiming that we've reached our final destination of a post-racist society, we are still very much in the midbar. We're still very much in the wilderness. As Jews, there should be nothing more disheartening and unacceptable to us than the rise of bigotry and hate based on skin color or peoplehood. It is, after all, the essence of our post-Exodus identity that we were strangers, that we were oppressed, and that we will never allow ourselves or anyone else to feel that hate ever again. That's what we promised. That's what we continue to promise. That's what this holiday of Pesach is all about. But right now, race-based hatred is on the rise in this country, especially towards, in this moment, the AAPI community, Asian American and Pacific Islanders. And that hate is rising at a shocking rate. And you don't have to trust me or agree or disagree with me. The statistics speak for themselves. And what they tell us is that very, very clearly, we're not in a post-racist society. We're still very much leaving Egypt. And we might have even taken some steps back to that land of shackles, of burden, and of ensnarement. I have my own thoughts and opinions about why we're here in this wilderness of bigotry and xenophobia, but those opinions, those thoughts aren't going to help us this morning because they don't get our feet moving and pushing forward to the place we know that we're supposed to go. So instead of thoughts and theories of hypothesis and analysis, let me say as boldly and as clearly as I can for the sake of Pesach, for this great holiday that we are observing, what I think is necessary for our leaving Egypt, for our really leaving Egypt, for putting us on the path towards a place of plowshares and pruning hooks, of vines and fig trees. And I'll start by telling a little story. A little over a month ago, our Beta Midrash class was proposed with a hypothetical question that turned out to be not so hypothetical for many of us. The scenario was this: to imagine that you're at a big dinner party with acquaintances, maybe neighbors or coworkers, and at some point during the meal, the host makes an anti-Semitic comment. Maybe an anti-Semitic comment, maybe a slur, maybe a conspiracy theory. What do you do? And so I'll ask you, just as I asked the group that Thursday night, to think of you, if you were in that scenario, what would you do? And what if it wasn't an anti-Semitic slur? What if it was a conspiracy theory about Asian Americans? Or a vitriolic comment about the AAPI community? What would you do in that moment, at that dinner? For several of us in the class, the answer was built into what we've always been taught. We either ignore it, sticks and stones, right? Or we wait until the dinner is over and approach the individual or individuals in private to let them know that we were hurt or offended by what they said. After all, again, this is what we've been taught. We don't want to spoil the evening or ruin dinner. Now, if we take away the hypothetical and place the metaphor of that dinner into our society, in America in general, at dinner parties, on the bus, at the grocery store, or at the ballpark, chances are that many of us would answer in the same way. We try to speak up in private when there's an appropriate time to do so. And we say that we whisper that need, that we need some change and we need it now. But here's the thing about that metaphor. Even though it feels relatable, it's antithetical to what America is supposed to be. Because the whole idea of America is that there aren't hosts at the dinner table. That there's not someone sitting at the head of the table who is allowed to control the conversation or lead our conversation in the first place. This isn't a dinner that we're invited to. It's a potluck. And everyone, just like at the Pesach Seder, sits at a seat of honor. So as we keep quiet, afraid of spoiling the meal or upsetting anyone who fallaciously awarded themselves the role of host, we end up perpetuating the inequality of power that was never real to begin with. We help perpetuate a lie. To which I say, in the spirit of Pesach, in the spirit of Passover, Dayenu, must speak. With all due respect, it's enough already. We have spent so long worrying about not ruining dinner and just being thankful we got an invitation to the table in the first place that we have not only allowed Pharaoh to travel through the wilderness with us, but we have perpetually and consistently given him a megaphone and a makom kavua, a permanent place of tolerance and respect. Must speak. Dayenu. It's enough. Enough with the wilderness already. It's enough with the wandering and the speculating when we're ever going to reach the places we know we're destined to go. It's enough looking back, and it's enough silence. Because right now, there are far too many people who feel emboldened in their hate, who feel so comfortable with their perceived superiority that the bigotry comes out of their mouths and out of the tips of their typing fingers without a second thought. The dinners are becoming more frequent, and the self-assumed hosts are growing more and more confident in their bigotry. Because around the rest of the table, there's a palpable silence. There's acquiescence. Not anymore. Dayenu. It's time to be okay with ruining dinner. And quite frankly, it's time to start making a scene. To ruin the dinner loudly and passionately, because speaking to those fake hosts at the end of the night in a private way has gotten us bubkis. And if anything, our silence has shown others that we ourselves are okay with how these people have been speaking and acting. And we're not. We're not okay with it. Because we are reminded not just every year as we celebrate this great holiday of ours, but every day as we recall the central narrative of the Jewish people, that we were strangers in the land of Egypt, and the Egyptians dealt harshly with us. And that was the first of a long history of our people being othered and oppressed. It's built into our DNA. We know how painful it is. The Exodus began. It is far from having been completed. And so while our Asian brothers and sisters, not just Asian Jews, but all Asians and Pacific Islanders who are being targeted for their appearance, are suffering at the hands of bigotry and hate and otherness, we're going to remember that we promised not to stay quiet. And despite what we've been told, despite the myth and the lies that we've somehow reached the promised land of equity and mutual respect, that somehow we're beyond the days of hate, and hate based on race or ethnicity, we're going to keep trekking through the midbar, through the wilderness, and you better believe that we're going to ruin some big dinners along the way. You know, we Jews get a bad rap for how we communicate, for interrupting during conversation, for speaking loudly and maybe sometimes crassly, for expressing openly strong opinions, and for this we're sometimes called rude or uncouth. But those labels miss the entire point and the entire heartbeat of who we are as a people. Because we Jews don't speak rudely or provincially, we speak passionately, and we speak with heart. We speak because we care about what we hear and what we have to say. So much so that sometimes we need to say immediately what we're thinking in the moment because our hearts are ready to burst. That's not something to apologize for. It's the silence that requires apology. It's the lack of passion. It's the apathy, the self-focus that is taught to be the guiding light of our society. It's the dinners that assume and rely on hate having a place at the table that are deserving of apology. So as we prepare for these final days of our commemoration of the Exodus, as the Sadarim are behind us, and before us lie Yizkor and Havdalah, let us remember that these last days are even more important than the first. Because these are the days when we answer the question, Nu, what were you here for? And we respond by saying that we didn't just want to party. We packed up our lives in the dead of night and we walked into the unknown because we promised to never let Egypt write the story of how people should be treated, any people. And we'll keep our promise. And we'll do so with interjections and interruptions, with raised voices and strong opinions, because we are sitting through some truly disgusting dinners. And it's about time that we stopped being afraid of ruining them.